Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, a podcast about early American history with Liz Covart. The study of history is key to understanding who we are and how we can affect a better future. Ben Franklin's World will introduce you to historical people and events that have impacted and shaped our present-day world. And now, here's your host, Liz Covart.
Hello, and welcome to episode 40 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. Political drama. This is something that has been shaped by history and affects the present-day world we live in. I mean, every time we turn on the news, check out the front page of our newspapers, or skim the titles of our favorite blog, many of us will find that some issue or someone has gone awry in the United States Congress. However, we can take comfort in the fact that political drama is not a new development in the United States. From the earliest days of the United States government, Congress and presidents have experienced drama and controversies. Today, we are going to explore the very first controversy to ripple through the United States Senate and House of Representatives, the presidential title controversy of 1789. Our guide into this controversy is Kathleen Bartoloni-Tuazon, author of For Fear of an Elective King, George Washington and the Presidential Title Controversy of 1789. During our investigation, Kata reveals the origins of the presidential title controversy, the different titles senators, congressmen, and ordinary citizens proposed and favored for their new president, and the ways in which specific individuals involved in the controversy shaped precedents for the offices of president and vice president that we still use today. So, are you ready to abandon today's political drama for that of 1789? The fourth episode in our Happy Birthday United States series continues with Kathleen Bartoloni-Tuazon.
With tidings and wisdom to share about our early American past, here is this week's special guest.
Kathleen Bartoloni-Tuazon is a visiting scholar at the First Federal Congress Project in Washington, D.C., and a lecturer on the early presidency. She earned her Ph.D. in early American history from the George Washington University. Kata is the author of For Fear of an Elective King, George Washington and the Presidential Title Controversy of 1789. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Kata.
Well, thank you so much, Liz. I'm very excited and honored to be here.
Major political controversies seem to plague the United States government at least a few times every year. And today, Kata is here to help us explore the first major controversy to trouble Congress, which was the presidential title controversy of 1789. Now, Kata, before we get into the controversy, would you tell us a bit about yourself and how you became interested in George Washington and the title controversy?
Well, I think, Liz, that throughout my life, I've been very interested in qualities of leadership and how people respond to leaders. In addition, the idea or the issue of the presidency and the presidency's place within a government based on popular sovereignty has also always kind of intrigued me, since it's not a perfect fit, actually, to have this singular executive within this popular sovereignty. And I saw the presidential title controversy, which was really the very first dispute between the House and the Senate at the beginning of the constitutional era, as just a sort of an indicator that the presidency was very controversial and that the title controversy wasn't just a joke or a question of etiquette, which it's often dismissed as. As a result, the idea of looking at Washington a little bit more closely and looking at the title controversy in terms of the presidency, not in terms of just etiquette, seemed like a natural fit for me.
And what is the First Federal Congress Project, and what sort of records and work do they do there?
Well, that was a wonderful sort of serendipitous connection for me. The First Federal Congress Project is loosely affiliated with George Washington University, and it's an archive dedicated to assembling and organizing the documentary history of the First Federal Congress, which was from 1789 to 1791. There are about 19 volumes published right now, and they'll probably go to about 22 when all is said and done. Much like the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution or the documentary history of the first federal election, these documentary history projects basically complement the projects that exist that are looking at publishing in a documentary way all of the papers of the various historical figures, Washington papers, Adams papers, etc.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, I think it is fantastic, and they're not just dealing with individuals. These are like ratification is an issue. The election was a political experience for the nation, the first election, and the first Congress also dealt with individuals, and it also has all the information that has to do with what Congress was doing in those first 2 years.
Let's dig into the title controversy. Would you tell us about the presidential title controversy and when it began? What questions did it raise?
Well, even before the controversy actually began in the spring of 1789, questions about what to call George Washington as president and what to call the president were already circulating. Washington had already been called as commander-in-chief of the Revolutionary Forces, Your Excellency. He was also General Washington. And actually, Excellency and General were terms that were used for him after he retired his commission, and they were actually terms that were used for him for the rest of his life. But the idea of him being president, this new role for him, there were people who wondered, okay, he's is he the equivalent of a king? Does he need to be addressed in that way? But this is a republic, what should we do? Also, there were concerns about the presidency. Was it going to be a strong position, too strong, monarchical? Was it going to be weak, a weak position and subject to corruption? So perhaps it needed to have a strong title to shore up its authority, but maybe not too strong to make it monarchical. There was this push-pull going on in relation to how the presidency was going to be perceived. Even after Congress settled on the modest title of president instead of something regal, the issue still led to a huge public conversation about titles in America and titling the president. The presidency was a new position. It was something the world had not seen before, and everybody had an opinion.
What sorts of titles are people proposing that they call President Washington? And why are early Americans so hung up on the question of titles?
Well, people were hung up on titles somewhat because during the Revolution, this wave of egalitarianism that came with the Revolution brought people more into a feeling that everyone was equal. But at the same time, elites still existed, and many of those elites had titles. So many of the common people felt they needed titles too. Mr. became more prominent in the culture of America after the Revolution, and all kinds of individual positions in the localities, like judges, doctors, everybody kind of used a title to help show that they were equal to the elites that were called Excellency. The governors were called Excellency, or Honorable, which was what the senators were called. So that was part of the hang-up, is trying to figure out how are we going to be equal, and will titles help everyone feel more equal? The various forms of Highness and Majesty that were suggested for Washington were a part of that larger cultural scene, and some of the forms of majesty and highness that were considered: elected majesty, elected highness, supreme highness, serene highness, magistracy, excellency. Even Washington's name of Washington was considered a possibility for a title, as well as titles like President General and President. These were all in the mix. Most of them had regal overtones, though.
I was going to say most of them sound very imperial or monarchical, that you'd hear them addressed to emperors or kings.
Exactly. There was a big concern about whether Washington and the President of the United States over the years was going to be able to have the same authority and respect when dealing with foreign leaders. and all the foreign leaders were kings. So people wanted to make sure that the President of the United States would have a certain level of authority. However, the United States was based on a Republican model, and this model and the revolution's sentiments did not really accept the idea that our president would be the equivalent of a king.
I'm intrigued by what you said earlier, that after the revolution, many men started using the title of Mr. I mean, Mr. is something that's so ubiquitous today. We use it in terms of polite conversation. What did they use before the revolution? Did they have titles?
Well, before the revolution, in some areas, Mr. was a title that was used by landholders. And there were other people that over the years, if they could prove their worth or that they had certain kinds of property, they would also then acquire the name of Mr. They could acquire that over the course of time and within their own locality. So then after the revolution, there was an even greater use of the term Mr. by just about everyone. That and Esquire wasn't just used for lawyers. It was used quite widely. In fact, there were newspaper articles that complained that Esquire was being used for anybody who didn't have any other title. So there was this need to somehow balance the playing field in terms of how all of these mostly men were titled.
I think I have a feel for how these early Americans feel because I'm now fascinated by this idea of titles for the common man. But I suppose we should return to the focus of our conversation, which is the presidential title controversy. In Fear for an Elective King, Kata reveals that the presidential title controversy had two phases, a congressional phase and a public phase. Kata, would you tell us about the congressional phase? What did the first congressmen and senators think about the titles that John Adams and others had proposed?
Well, the presidential title controversy officially began with a Senate resolution to discuss possible titles for the president. And this was a resolution that was proposed by Richard Henry Lee, a senator from Virginia. And actually, he had been an anti-federalist, and people are surprised that he was so in favor of having a strong regal title for the king. But he, like others, worried not so much about a strong king, but about a weak king, and that a weak king could be subject to corrupt forces and corrupt influences, especially corrupt influences from state elites. Now, his resolution to look at a title began the same day that Washington arrived in New York City on May 23rd, 1789. And for the next 3 weeks, the Senate and the House met in various subcommittees trying to come up with a title. The Senate was trying very hard to figure out a title that would give the president what they felt was the right amount of respect and authority. But the House was adamantly opposed to any title other than the civic title mentioned in the Constitution, which is president. What the Senate wanted was some honorific that would precede George Washington, President of the United States, something like His Highness or His Serenity or His Majesty or something before the name George Washington, President of the United States. So the Senate was very interested in trying to come up with a title that would be one of the titles that would please John Adams and others that were allies. And Adams wanted something more than just excellency, which is what was already the address used for all the governors in the states, and also used for the president of the Confederation Congress at that time. He was addressed as Your Excellency. So Washington would need something grander as far as Adams was concerned, and many of the senators agreed with him. Not all of them. William McClay, Charles Carroll from Maryland, and William McClay from Pennsylvania were against it from the beginning, and McClay was particularly vocal about it. But in the House, totally against it, and the majority of Americans agreed with the House on this issue.
John Adams would take a lot of flack for his introduction of regal titles for the presidency. I mean, people were calling him his rotundity behind his back. And I think it's interesting that Richard Henry Lee is also involved, because when we spoke with Danielle Allen in episode 18 about the Declaration of Independence, she mentioned how Richard Henry Lee and John Adams worked together to introduce the resolution to declare independence. Was there any sort of cooperation here for this resolution in the Senate, or did this just happen by accident?
Oh, no, it didn't happen by accident. Adams and Lee came in to the new government with a very strong political cachet from their years and their cooperation during the Revolution. They both were very powerful figures. Now, during the ratification period, Richard Henry Lee wrote quite strongly against the Constitution, and he was most worried that there weren't amendments to the Constitution built right in. And he went to Congress mainly to fight for amendments, which he did quite strongly. But he and Adams both also had an aversion to the power that state elites wielded. And he was very concerned about a weak president being subject to corrupt influences from these state elites. And John Adams was in the same boat. They both agreed with this. They didn't want this strong president because they wanted a monarch. They wanted a strong president that could fight off corruption and cabals from state elites, or perhaps, foreign influences as well. So they were on the same page when it came to the title controversy. The difference between the two of them is that once the title controversy was over, Lee moved on to amendments to the Constitution, which was his main reason for being a senator in the first place. And Adams worked still behind the scenes lobbying for a strong president one way or another. I mean, he wanted an absolute veto, for example, and these kinds of issues just kept his monarchical tendencies in the forefront, whereas Lee moved on to issues that were more in line with the way the House and much of the Senate felt when it came to amendments. So even though their friendship in the beginning did influence the title controversy, in the end, the long-term effect of the title controversy on their reputations was different.
You touched a bit about this in your last response, but why do you think John Adams and others really thought that they needed a monarchical or imperial title for the presidency? Why were they worried that the presidency would be so weak? Why did they think a title would strengthen it?
Well, I think part of the impression that they had about why King George III had sort of let down America was that he was corrupted and influenced by his courtiers, and various people in court manipulated him. And they were very worried that the president, which is that part of the Constitution that explains what the president is going to do and is somewhat vague. And they were worried that rather than being too strong, it would be a weak position, and it wouldn't be balanced with the other branches within the constitutional government that was being set up. And so they really worried about corruption overtaking the presidency, and they felt that that was a bigger concern and a bigger worry than some despotic monarchical person overtaking the presidency. So their concern was about cabals and about moneyed interests overtaking the presidency. When we look at our government today and we see the influence that money does have, can we really say that they were completely wrong to be worried about that? It's a legitimate concern. It wasn't the greatest concern at the time, though. People were just still remembering the revolution. They were against anybody who even would resemble a monarch by having any title at all. So that was the greater concern. But Adams's worry about corrupt influences was legitimate, and the reason that he and others were as persistent as they were.
In the congressional phase, they are debating this title. The House is, as you said, is definitely against it. The Senate is actually considering it. And we've heard the titles that they've proposed. But Kata, what are they talking about in the public phase? What did Americans outside of Congress think that the president's title should be? And are they as worried about cabals and corruption as those in the Senate are?
Well, the majority of Americans agreed with the House. They were absolutely opposed. They agreed with William McClay in the Senate, who at the beginning was kind of a lone voice, and then over time more senators agreed with him that there should not be a regal title for the president, that the president could be strong on his own. So the majority of Americans were definitely not in favor of a strong title, a regal title. There was a vocal minority, though, that felt that there could be anarchy. They didn't trust this new Constitution. They didn't trust democracy, et cetera. And so they worried about anarchy. They worried about corruption, et cetera. But the vast majority of Americans, there was a vocal minority, and some of these people were newspaper publishers, so they had a vehicle for their opinions.
What did George Washington think as people are debating the titles that he should or shouldn't be called? Did he like any of the proposed titles?
Well, the title controversy began before he arrived in New York City. The resolution to consider titles happened the day he arrived in New York. He was apprised of it after the fact. And he's on record as saying, I didn't like this idea from the beginning. I advised against it. I foresaw how controversial it was going to be. And so he argued against the whole titles campaign. But there's no evidence that he ever recommended any specific title. What we know is that he argued against a grand title and against the title campaign, and we also know that he was greatly relieved with the outcome of nothing more than the civic title of president.
In For Fear of an Elective King, Cotter reveals that George Washington and James Madison actually had a close relationship. Cotta, did the relationship between Washington and Madison influence the outcome of the title controversy in any way? And what was the outcome of the controversy?
Okay, now, Washington and Madison were very close during this period. Washington was often very circumspect, as we know, and Madison often functioned as Washington's public voice. And I really feel that during this first year of Washington's administration, if you listen to Adams, you're hearing what Washington felt quite a bit at the time. Now, Adams, the House debates were open. The Senate was closed at that time, but the House debates were open, and Madison spoke against various high titles more than once on the House floor. He argued against a title in letters as well as publicly, and his opinion mattered. And he was a very influential member in the House. And so people listened to what he had to say, and many people realized that he had Washington's ear. So Washington gave Madison quite a bit of latitude to help him write the inaugural address and to write replies to the inaugural address. The president's replies to the House, the House wrote a reply to the inaugural address almost immediately, and they addressed the president as just a sir. And Washington told Adams, basically, now I have to write a reply to the House saying thanks, and you go ahead and do that. He's basically giving Madison permission. He's accepting that the House used a simple address for the president. He is basically in line with the House's position behind the scenes, and this did influence the final outcome.
When I read For Fear of an Elective King, it seemed to me that the adoption of a simple title of Sir or President helped Americans accept their new government, which was new. The government under the Constitution of 1787 was brand new. Did I read that correctly? And if I did, would you tell us how the simple title helped Americans accept their new government?
Yeah, the Senate goes on record when they come up with a resolution saying, we think his title should be His Highness, the President of the United States of America and Protector of their liberties. But we want to remain in harmony with the House, which is something that Washington asked them to do in his inaugural address. He says, cooperate. Basically, it's one of the things that he says in the inaugural, and they say, okay, we're going to stay in harmony, and we're going to basically just address him as the president without addition of title. And what this shows the American people is that there was this debate in the House and the Senate, and there were these different possibilities, but the outcome was the outcome that the majority of Americans approved of. So this gave Americans more confidence that the Congress would come out in favor of positions that they could get behind, that they could approve of. In addition, they were convinced that Washington also approved of this outcome, and Washington's approval and him never saying, I think I should be addressed as Majesty or Mightiness, which is a rumor that came about in the 19th century that he approved Mightiness, which there's no evidence he ever did. The fact that he was fine with just the simple title gave them confidence in the presidency as well, that they were confident in the presidency as long as Washington was the president, but he couldn't live forever. So this gave them confidence that the presidency over the long term would be in some way a position that could be representative of the people and not separate from the people in the way a king is separate.
Let's look at some of the long-term and near-term consequences of this controversy. What was the fallout of the controversy for men like John Adams, who had proposed some of those regal titles for the president?
Well, during that period, once the title controversy was over in the House and the Senate, which happened May 14th, 1789, and people became aware of this whole controversy, the entire summer and fall, and then a little bit throughout the next few years. But that summer, it was like the Twitter feed gone viral. It erupted in the press, and John Adams in particular was eviscerated in the press. Now, you mentioned earlier that among his colleagues, he was the butt of jokes and called his rotundity. But in the press that summer, all through the United States, I mean, not just among his colleagues, but everywhere, he was ridiculed as the dangerous vice. There was a long poem written about it, and this poem basically compared Adams who was the vice president, to the vice of monarchy. And here's this man, just a heartbeat away from the presidency, that is affiliated with the vice of monarchy. So he was eviscerated. He strained friendships. He lost patriotic credentials and political influence. And it haunted him for years, and it haunted his presidency once he became president. When he was referred to derisively in real terms whenever he would overstep, like during the times of the Alien Sedition Acts, etc. He would be ridiculed, and they would still come back and use His Highness, His Excellency. President Adams wants to, is acting like a monarch. So he lost a lot, and a lot of the bad publicity fell directly onto Adams. There was some backlash against Richard Henry Lee and a few others, but that faded, whereas the backlash on Adams remained.
The backlash from the press makes his rotundity sound like the least of his problems. Like that was the polite thing being said about him.
His rotundity was definitely, I'm sure that he heard it. I'm sure that he heard it, and, snickering in the halls of Congress. I mean, I can just hear it even now. But that poem, The Dangerous Vice, did a lot of harm. And if you start to read his letters, once it came out in August of 1789, and then you read his letters in September to some of his friends, you can just hear how exhausted he is, and how disheartened he is with the negative publicity that he's receiving. And he's been receiving in other ways all summer long.
How did this controversy affect the working relationship between Adams and Washington as the first president and vice president? Because it seems that the controversy placed those two at ideological odds from one another.
Well, it did. And in the letter where Washington says, listen, I argued against this, I thought it was a bad idea, he actually says it's to be regretted that he, meaning John Adams, pursued this. So he was angry with Adams about the title controversy, and having this big controversy over the presidency in the early days of his administration was not something that Washington had anticipated was going to be the big problem. As a result, Washington backed away from John Adams, basically from the beginning of his time as president. If you think about it, Adams was not really a major advisor to the president. I mean, Washington could have given him a cabinet-like position, but he didn't. Washington backed away from Adams, and I believe that this led to a diminished capacity and a diminishment of the vice presidency that continues to this day. Ironically, I will say that even though Adams sacrificed in many ways the vice presidency, this action of the diminishment of the vice presidency led to a more consolidated and expanded role for the president and helped produce the strong president that Adams had sought through a grand title. So presidential power was pledged not by flaunting it, and it gained the people's trust by being modest in its approach to the office.
That's pretty incredible how a disagreement ended up shaping both offices. It makes you wonder, I mean, what would have happened if things had turned out differently? The Time Warp is a fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently or if someone had acted differently.
The Time Warp. Historians can't predict the future, but they can speculate about what might have been.
I would like to know, in your opinion, what might have happened if George Washington had wanted a regal title? Do you think that Congress and the American people would have accepted it? And how would that agreement between John Adams and Washington that there should be a regal title have changed their working relationship?
Well, I think that even if Washington had favored a grand title, the people were strongly against it. And I think he would have taken a lot of criticism, much like he did in years before when he joined the elite society of the Cincinnati, a society made up of the officers who had served under him during the Revolution. He got a lot of criticism for joining them and being a part of what people thought of as an elite institution that could lead to a nobility in America. So I think he would have gotten a lot of criticism for not living up to the public ideal. So I feel that there would have been no grand title, that the outcome would have been the same. But I will say that I do think that if he had favored an exalted title, even if he would have, had to tamp down on that because he would have gotten criticism, I think it could have damaged the people's trust in the presidency to some degree. I mean, his favoring being with the people, his nod to the people on this issue helped garner respect for the office and trust in the office. And I do think that if he would have been on the other side of the issue, that he would have taken criticism. It could have damaged his reputation somewhat, not a lot, but somewhat, I think. And in the long term, I think it would have, though, damaged the people's trust in the presidency, a trust that he brought to the office by not favoring the grand title. As far as Washington and Adams are concerned, even if they would have agreed, I think that there's a very good chance that Washington would have blamed Adams for bringing the subject up in the first place, because he would have gotten so much criticism. He would have been upset with Adams for bringing it up even though they agreed. Why bring it up, And so in all likelihood, he still would have backed away from Adams. One way or another, the title controversy and John Adams's role brought a diminished vice presidency. I see that outcome as being the same.
It's fascinating to think what would have happened if the president and vice president, if Adams and Washington would have worked more closely together, if it hadn't been a diminished vice presidency. I mean, when you think of all the presidential and vice presidential pairings throughout the years, can you imagine Thomas Jefferson and John Adams working close together, or Abraham Lincoln and Andrew Johnson working close together? I mean, it's fascinating to think about.
Well, I'll tell you, Adams at one point during his presidency refers in a letter that he wrote to Abigail, his wife, he actually refers to Jefferson, his vice president at the time, as the dangerous vice for other reasons. But he still remembered that aspersion from years before, and he referred to Jefferson that way. And he saw Jefferson as a danger to him. So no, they did not work together. And through those first years, you don't see the president and the vice president's role as being much more than just the person that's there in case the president dies, that will take over the office. And yet, if Washington he could have made the vice president the equivalent of the Secretary of State. Or he could have given him some other big role to play in the government. And he didn't. And so presidents over the years have been trying to figure out what to do with their vice president. And some have given them a lot of power, but most have not. In most cases, we can't even remember who the vice president is.
This has been an excellent window into our early American past, because when we think of Congress or the powers that Congress and the president and the vice president have, we tend to think of how they're outlined, like written down in the Constitution. But your story about the presidential title controversy clearly illustrates how much these offices were shaped by the people who held them and not just words on paper.
Yeah, I agree. Thank you so much for saying that. I think that's a great observation. I think they're also shaped by the people, not just the people who have the office, but by the people themselves, because they're either accepting what these people are doing or not, or criticizing them. And I do think that's a role that the populace and the electorate have to this day, and it helps shape the way the people who are elected do their jobs.
Kata, before we conclude, would you tell us what aspect of history you're researching and writing about now?
Well, I'm still interested in the role of the presidency within a popular sovereignty. Those first principles of executive leadership that I identified as Washington using during the time of the title controversy, sort of an acceptance of modesty in terms of how to present the presidency to the people, and a nod to the people in their people's will on issues. I'll be exploring this a little bit more. I'm going to be on a panel at OAH 2016 in Providence, Rhode Island, which the main subject of that conference is going to be leadership. And I want to look into whether Washington used a similar approach in other issues during his administration. I think that's something that needs to be explored a little bit more, whether these principles of modesty and a nod to the people's will was something that he used behind the scenes or in other ways with some of the other big issues during his administration. I'm also in the early stages of a new project, and I'm looking at how outsiders viewed the new nation at the beginning of the early republic's constitutional era. I'm interested in how the nation was perceived and how that may have influenced ideas of national identity.
That's fantastic that you'll be at the OAH, which is the Organization of American Historians. That's an annual conference, and it's a rather big conference, a gathering of all historians who study America, or most of them, those who can make it. So you're more than welcome, of course, to attend that conference. There is a fee associated with it, but then you can go hear Kata's panel. Kata, where's the best place to look for more information about you, your work, and how to get in contact with you?
Well, I have an author page that's just my full name, KathleenBartoloni-Tuazon.com. And my webpage has a lot of information about my book and about myself. And there's even a way to get in touch with me on the webpage. My book, For Fear of an Elective King, has its own Facebook page as well. And I'm LinkedIn, although I'm not as active on that as I should be. And my book, For Fear of an Elective King, is available through Cornell University Press and via Amazon and all the other usual suspects.
We'll include links to those places on the show notes page for this episode. Kata, thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining us today. This was a really fascinating conversation.
Well, it's been absolutely so much fun to talk to you. It's great to be a part of this whole effort that you're putting together, Liz. Thank you.
Today, we address our president with the simple title of Mr. President. And perhaps in the near future, we might use the title Madam President. We don't know. But all of this could have been very different. We might be addressing our president as his or her most gracious majesty today if it hadn't been for George Washington, James Madison, and other men who served in the House of Representatives who worked to keep the trappings of monarchy off the new government in 1789. With all of that said, I do not think we should look down upon John Adams or Richard Henry Lee. As we discovered in episode 39 with Eric Nelson and today with Kata, these men genuinely worried that if they did not use a regal title to address the president, then the world that they lived in, a European-dominated world, would not respect the new country. And if the new country didn't have respect, how long could it maintain its independence? These were thoughts that crossed John Adams and Richard Henry Lee's minds. You can find more information about Kata, her book, For Fear of an Elective King, plus everything we talked about today on the show notes page for this episode, benfranklinsworld.com/040. Of course, you wouldn't have to go to the website to find the show notes if you signed up for the Franklin Gazette, which you can do by visiting the website or by texting BF World to 33444. And that will get you the show notes of every episode that we air from now on right in your inbox. And it will also get you access to Poor Richard's Club, which is a fun place on Facebook where listeners of Ben Franklin's World and I hang out and we talk about history, share articles and pictures of places that we visited. So it's a really fun place to hang out, and we hope you'll consider joining us there. Now, would you like to support Ben Franklin's World? Please tell your friends, family, and other people, as many people as you can find really, about the history we investigate on the show and about the show. Word-of-mouth recommendations and intelligence is how we are going to help get more people interested in history in general. Finally, does knowing about the presidential title controversy change the way you think about our revolutionary heroes of Washington, Adams, and Richard Henry Lee? Share your thoughts by posting a comment either to the show notes page or in Poor Richard's Club by sending me an email to liz@benfranklinsworld.com or tweeting me @LizCovart.
And remember, never leave till tomorrow that which you can do today.